Our sermon text today will come from Mark chapter 2. If you're following in your Bibles, it'll be on page 1554. If you're in your own Bible, that's Mark chapter 2. We'll start at verse 13. We've been going through the Gospel of Mark. Actually, we just started really. Last week was our first week really diving into the first chapter. Today we're on the second chapter in Mark chapter 2. And we begin at the 13th verse. Listen for God's word. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. Jesus is a fantastic teacher. He must have been an amazing teacher, and we know that in part because we have his content and his curriculum in the New Testament. We know what he taught us, and so we go back and we review it. And one of the things we know, especially about his curriculum and the way he taught, his pedagogy, his method, is still being used and employed by the best teachers today. That is to take stories about things that we're familiar with and use those stories to illustrate bigger concepts, to teach his students about divine things. This is called telling a parable. And not today, but at some point here in the Gospel of Mark, we'll get to go through and see how Jesus uses parable to teach. But it's a fantastic teaching method that even the best teachers today are working on continuing to employ. But not only is it the way in which Jesus taught, he's a fantastic teacher for what he taught. He's a rabbi, and so he's teaching on the Old Testament, and he teaches it in a way that astounds even the scholars of his day. He's able to take the whole Old Testament and summarize it in a really succinct way. He gives the greatest commandment and then the second commandment like it. I don't know if you've ever tried to read through the Old Testament. It's not an easy book to read through, and it's many books. They're not easy books to get through. Most people start out at the beginning, Genesis, and they read Genesis. They get about halfway through Exodus, and then they get into the last half, and then Leviticus, Numbers. You start going, oh my gosh, this is a lot to read. Well, Jesus takes all of the Old Testament and summarizes it really well in saying this: the greatest commandment is to love God. Love God with all that you are. And then the second part is like this: to love your neighbor as yourself. That's called the golden rule, isn't it? That's something that's so timeless. We're still talking about the golden rule: treat others how you want to be treated. It came from Jesus. He's a fantastic teacher. But not only is Jesus a fantastic at curriculum and at content, he must have also been a dynamic speaker, because everywhere he goes in the New Testament, he's drawing these huge crowds. You may have the best stuff in the world, but if you're not at least have some sort of dynamic nature to you, people are going to snooze, they're going to doze off on you. But not Jesus. He's drawing these crowds that come out from everywhere to hear him speak. It's really a great thing about my job. I love it because my job is to teach what Jesus taught. And we inevitably know that when people are teaching what Jesus taught, that there are going to be crowds. I don't mean necessarily a mega church. There's a crowd here today. We're gathered here today. If there's not a crowd, then there's something wrong. Maybe you have someone who's teaching that's not really called to be a teacher. Those kinds of people that maybe they've got other skills, but they probably shouldn't be teaching. They can take the most interesting concept in the world and make it a snooze fest. You know people like that. Maybe they're great people, but they probably shouldn't be teaching. Maybe that's the case, but sometimes it's also the case that crowds dwindle and go away when you fail to teach what Jesus taught. Because what Jesus taught is always captivating. It always speaks to us. It's a timeless reality, that these things that Jesus taught. So we know that Jesus is a great teacher, and what he taught is still speaking to us today. Let's see what he does next, though, as he is teaching along this lake shore. Here's what happens in verse 14. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. Levi got up, and he followed him. In Jesus' time, a tax collector was a reprehensible, a morally bankrupt sort of occupation to have. Now, don't go cheer and say, yeah, man, we don't like those IRS guys. We're not going to pay our taxes. It's not the same as it is today as it was back then. Our tax collectors are good and decent people. They're doing a job that our society needs. It was different in Jesus' time. In Jesus' time, Rome would, and this is why it was different, Rome would issue a tax collector's license. And actually, they would sell them. They'd sell you a tax collector's license, and then you were officially a tax collector of Rome. What that license allowed you to do was to use force to extort money from people for their taxes. Now, Rome didn't care. As long as they got the amount that they needed, as long as they got their cut, Rome didn't care how much you extorted from people. So the tax collector comes and says, it's time to pay your taxes. And Rome may only need $5 from them, but they take 15 from you, and they pocket 10. And this was a form of legalized extortion. These were Roman gangsters, essentially. And Levi was probably a Jewish man who engaged in this against his own people. They were seen as traitors, as I said, as gangsters. It's not fair to compare a tax collector like we would think of now to tax collectors then. It would be more like comparing them to maybe a Colombian drug lord, some career like that, maybe a drug dealer. It would be like Jesus walking by the strip club and calling a stripper, come and follow me. That's the sort of moral impact that it has for the readers of the Gospel of Mark to hear that Jesus called a tax collector to come and follow him. What's also interesting is that we've moved, in coming from verse 13 to verse 14, we've moved from Jesus speaking to a crowd to speaking to an individual. Speaking to a general population to speaking to someone specifically, Levi. And it's not like he runs into Levi while Levi's out cutting his grass. He doesn't bump into Levi while he's in the grocery store. He finds Levi while he's engaged in this shameful activity, tax collecting. He's at the office. He's doing what he knows he shouldn't do, what he probably feels guilty about for extorting his own people. And it's in this place that Jesus finds Levi. And it's in this place that Jesus calls him. And that move has to happen for us at some point too, where we move from just being in the crowd, saying, yeah, Jesus' teachings, they're good for people, to where it moves to us individually, and we say, Jesus' teaching is good for me. And usually where that happens, where Jesus finds us, is not where we're doing things right. His word usually penetrates to the places that we're afraid to go because we know we've done or said or thought things we shouldn't, the shameful places in our life. And that's where Jesus finds us. And he says, I see you. I know who you are. I know what you've done. And I love you. Follow me. He sees us there and he knows us there. And that's the move we have to make. Let's see what happens next then in verse 15. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. Again, we see Jesus in a crowd, but this crowd's different, isn't it? The crowd before was coming because Jesus could offer them teaching, or the crowd before may have been coming because Jesus could offer them healing, or Jesus could offer them an exorcism to cast out demons. But this crowd's different. This crowd's here because Jesus has offered Levi something that they all want, and that is a relationship. They all want what we all in this room want, to be known, to be really and authentically known. Now, the scary part about that, there's sort of a double-edged sword. We want to be known. But we also know that if someone knows us fully for who we are, then they'll know all the dark corners. They'll know all the things about us. And so we want to be known, but we want to hide those things. We don't really want those things to be known. But Jesus meets Levi right in that dark corner. He comes right to that place, and Jesus comes right to that place for us, to know us. He sees us and he says, I know who you are. Follow me. And that's where evangelism really begins, isn't it? That's where it moves from just saying, come with me to an event. Come with me to church. Come with me to worship service. There we're just inviting people to know more about what Jesus taught. But when Jesus has known us, when he knows the things that we don't want anyone else to know, he knows that about us and he still loves us. That has such an impact. It begins to change us to know that we're known by God in the most intimate way. Then we no longer are inviting people to come and hear about Jesus. We're inviting people to come and know him and be known by him. You see the difference? It changes from inviting people to an event to inviting them into a relationship with Jesus. And that's what Levi does. That's why he invites all these tax collectors, his friends, who he knows are as lonely as he is on the inside, to be known by Jesus. Here's verse 16. When the teachers of the law who were Pharisees saw him eating with the sinners and the tax collectors, they asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" And that's why we don't want to be known, isn't it? Because we're afraid of, maybe not scribes and Pharisees, but we're afraid of what the culture will say, what the people around us will say if we're really fully known. Then they'll say, "How can you be a Christian? How can you, a sinner?" If people really knew who you were, would they really know that you're a Christian? Because you are one of those that Jesus eats with, the sinners and the tax collectors. That's what we're afraid of. The people will find that out about us. And yet Jesus knows that. And here he is eating with them. Here's how Jesus responds to those who would critique, to those who would say, "You, a Christian, a sinner?" In verse 17, on hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I've not come to call the righteous, but sinners." That's one of my favorite verses in Scripture, and I really can't add anything to it. That's a powerful verse, isn't it? I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners. But I will point out this, that verse speaks to two different groups of people. It speaks to the righteous and it speaks to sinners, both of which are groups that are filth sanctuaries across this country, across the world. There are those who come to church and they dutifully are there every Sunday, and they come and they listen to what the preacher has to say, and they, oh yeah, but they feel like, I'm a pretty good person. I just apply these techniques and learn these things from the Bible, and I do that because that's what good people do. Those are the righteous. But then there's those of us who know that that's not our reality. That we come to church and we're sinners. And I think sometimes preachers can downplay this. They say, "Oh yeah, sin's just, whoops, you messed up one time. You slipped into sin and now you just go to the church and take care of that and erase it." It's more than that though, isn't it? I mean, it's a deep struggle, at least it is for me, against sin. It's a reality that there's something in me that's broken that leads me into sin. It's an utter brokenness coming to church, and a shame even when I recognize, and maybe you too, when you realize what's going on. But the good news is for you. The good news is this, that Jesus didn't come for the righteous. He says, "I came to call sinners." He didn't come for those who are well and don't need a doctor. He's the great physician of our souls. We're here because he heals us. He calls us. He changes us. Jesus says, "I didn't come to call the righteous, but sinners." It's good news for me. It's good news for you. May this word be to the joy of God's people and for the great glory of our God and Father. Amen.